Again, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jose Juan Lara Jr., he, him, his, and I go by Jose Juan. I am a member of the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence. And we are, again, a culture-specific resource center on domestic violence and sexual assault within the Asian American, Pacific Islander communities. And we welcome you today to this panel discussion. Our panelists for today are Aracelia Aguilar, Empowerment Director with Deaf Hope, Payal Sinha, a Managing Attorney from Tajaray Justice Center, and Caitlin Fish, an attorney with the Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid. Today's conversation, we're going to focus on how to provide language access, specifically with legal service providers and advocates who work with legal service providers in urban, rural, and of course, border towns. This is an area of conversation that at API-GBV we were having, and we thought, sometimes geography does impact language access or linguistically accessible services. Also, before I forget, I want to give a tremendous thank you to the American Bar Association Commission on Domestic and Sexual Violence, who are co-sponsors for this event here today, especially Robin Turner, who was my colleague from the ABA-DV Commission in making this happen. So thank you, Robin, and the ABA Commission on Domestic and Sexual Violence. Eternally grateful for you all. The questions that we kind of formulated fall under three categories: identifying challenges, addressing linguistic diversity, and of course, the impact of geographic location and what does it look like. I also want to thank a lot of you who actually submitted questions for the panelists here today. And hopefully throughout our conversation, we'll address some of those questions. But again, we will try to address those towards the end of the panel discussion. So without further ado, I guess I'll just go ahead and ask the first question. Just what are the significant challenges legal providers face in ensuring language access for survivors who are limited English proficient or use different modes of communication, including those who speak indigenous languages or languages of limited diffusion? So I think I want to start off with Payal and ask you this question. Yeah, what are your thoughts?
Hi, I am Payal. I think it goes to a lot of things that we consider. It's very straightforward too, right? Shortages of having qualified interpreters, access to interpreters, understanding the difference between interpreter or translator, understanding what your role as a staff member, what is their role, understanding what it means to have trauma-informed services. Because we at our agency work with immigrant survivors of gender-based violence. So it's not one issue, but it's like a plethora of issues which are tied up and it's overlapping, right? And the biggest concern as a legal service provider is also understanding privacy and confidentiality, right? It's all tied up. But I think if we take a step back, when we say we work with survivors, I think it's a bigger issue in the sense that, not having interpreters or not having access to, language for limited English proficient individuals, it impacts them. It affects the quality of information that we are trying to supply, right? It is very frustrating. It is, shouting out and saying that we are, turning you away from any access, or just simply you have a question, we don't have this resource, we can't answer it. And if we don't understand what's going on, I don't think we can, resolve this. And I know this is like a very big, broad answer, but I think I want to start by that and we can dig more deeper into it.
Thank you, Payal. So Araceli, I want to go to you with this question because I think a lot of times when we talk about language access, we often default to spoken languages and we completely forget community members who use different modes of communication, like sign language, right? And I also believe, and you and I have had these conversations before, kind of including community members or participants who use languages of limited or lesser diffusion, like indigenous languages. So just kind of want to spotlight you for a minute, Araceli, and just get your thoughts around this particular question, the challenges legal providers face. And you also your role as an advocate in working with legal service providers who maybe sometimes don't get it, if we're going to be honest with each other, right? Because it can become very difficult. So yeah, what are your thoughts, Aracelia?
Yes, this is Aracelia. Thank you so much, Jose. Yeah, I think there are just so many barriers. Sometimes it's within the legal system themselves or lawyers' office themselves. One barrier I've experienced is trying to work with lawyers and attorneys. At Deaf Hope, we believe in co-advocacy. And the co-advocacy approach is when we try to ask a lawyer to see if we can be a part of the meeting to help bridge the cultural nuances between the deaf person and them. And sometimes you'll have an interpreter be in the room, but maybe they'll say, well, we don't have the finances for a CDI, which is a certified deaf interpreter. And so to just bring in a hearing interpreter, that might not be sufficient. And so oftentimes the deaf client will say, well, they'll maybe understand the bigger concepts, but maybe not in the weeds in terms of the details and how to break that down. And so it's really great to have a deaf advocate be a part of the meeting to say, okay, so what the lawyer is explaining, whatever that process is, what happens is that whatever the processing of the deaf individual might be, is that it varies among deaf people, right? So often after the meeting, the deaf client will say, I didn't understand so many of these items. What does this mean? And so then I allow for space and time to elaborate on those things. Sometimes the lawyer will say, no, we have to honor the attorney client's last privileges. We have to honor that. And it's right, but we go outside of that room, but then the client has more questions, and then I'm not able to offer support as best as I can because I don't have that information in that contextual space. And so the deaf survivor will go back to the attorney and go, I didn't understand the following. And I see that often where the attorneys get frustrated and go, I already explained this to you. And I said, right. But that's where the gap is. And so the deaf survivor who might experience language deprivation due to limited access to education and information, I really promote to allow for a deaf advocate to be part of your meetings, to support the attorney's process as well in explaining it's not just for the deaf survivor, and to also kindly be mindful that there might be some linguistic gaps. We don't know any possible interpreters that might know specific sign languages. So for instance, there was a deaf client that I know that moved here to the States from Mongolia and used Mongolian Sign Language. And I personally don't know any professionally certified interpreters, both deaf or hearing, who can interpret Mongolian Sign Language into ASL into English. So we had to be creative and ask a community member, someone from the community, come in, as well as a deaf interpreter, to be in the space. And we had to utilize language that way. So the deaf community member used Mongolian Sign Language, worked with a deaf interpreter, and then worked with a hearing interpreter and with me. We did compensate for that community member because, of course, for their time. But Anna will talk a little bit later about what it means to have a qualified interpreter versus a certified interpreter, because we often bump against that because of the ADA. The ADA often states that the interpreter has to be, qualified. But the truth is that sometimes, we actually need to look at certification, but maybe certification actually may not always be the best. So we need to actually take a look at both of those labels. And sometimes we'll have someone who has really beautiful language in their own way. And some deaf survivors go, wow, that interpreter is really clear. But unfortunately, that interpreter is not certified, but they're qualified. So there's a lot of experiences where there are BIPOC folks who are trying to get certified and trying to be certified, but there are barriers in terms of access and getting that qualification. So that's me trying to sum it up in a nutshell. I know that was a lot of information, but if you yourself are a legal consultant or advocate or lawyer, and you come across finding that this is a situation where you're not quite sure what to do, please contact a deaf advocacy organization. I have connections. I have networks for you from East Coast, West Coast. We can try to contact those folks, people that we know in our communities and in our networking that we can go ahead and call upon to support you in your work. Deaf organizations can be a partner to you in this, especially to you attorneys. Please ask us for help providing access, especially with interpreting or with language access. One last thing I want to mention, the ADA, or the Americans with Disabilities Act, hearing providers think that an ASL interpreter is enough, and that's a warm body. They've checked the box and they've been able to meet, quote unquote, the accommodations needed and access is made. But I have to say it here. I have to emphasize that's not always the case. Sometimes a hearing interpreter will come into the room. That still might be a barrier for the deaf interpreter, deaf client, because they might be having moved here from Mexico and maybe they only use grassroots signing, or they only have a sign language that the hearing interpreter doesn't know about or doesn't have access to. And so we want folks to please be mindful that there are a variety of languages that deaf people will come to the US with, or may have a different educational background to. They might use grassroots signing approach, that hearing interpreters may not always have that specialty or that knowledge. And so there might be folks who use coming from communities that use more of a grassroots ASL as opposed to quote unquote ASL taught in schools. And so just because you have gotten an interpreter doesn't necessarily mean that they are qualified. So I'll pass it back to Jose Juan. I have a lot more to elaborate on, but I'll wait to the following questions to be able to name those points and to add more information. So back to you. Thank you.
This is Jose Juan. Thank you, Aracelia. And I think you brought up a lot of concerns which similar issues surface when we talk about survivors who are limited English proficient, right, as well, assuming that people who speak Spanish have learned to use the Spanish language the same, which no, and other things, and also assuming literacy levels and forgetting the issue around how trauma impacts the ability to communicate in various different ways. But I do want to kind of make the same question to you, Caitlin, as well. But also, Aracelia mentioned this whole co-advocacy partnership between a shelter advocate or a domestic violence and sexual assault crisis center advocate with a legal service provider. And, you know, I have a very special place in my heart for Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid because I am from Brownsville, Texas, and TRALA for short was the legal service provider in my area. And I know with TRALA, one of your projects was to pair up the lawyer with shelter advocates. And we knew the benefits of that. So, you know, addressing the same question to you, Caitlin, but further also exploring the co-advocacy value from a shelter advocate or a domestic violence advocate, sexual assault advocates with a legal service provider.
Yes, this is Caitlin. I think definitely co-advocacy can be an amazing, invaluable part of supporting a survivor in their journey, in particular when we're dealing in the legal system, that even if we have a perfect world where everyone has a certified, qualified interpreter, we're dealing with this system that is almost like its a third language sometimes. It has very specific vocabulary. It has weird procedures. There are concepts that may not translate well to the client's native language. And so navigating all of those intricacies on top of working with a survivor who speaks a foreign language can be especially complicated, and can make the process, I think, even more difficult for the survivor to navigate, where they just are having a hard time grasping or understanding what is happening within the legal system. And this is also true for English speakers, but when you add the foreign language component on top of it, I think it makes the process even more difficult. And so I think one of the really beneficial parts of working with folks like a legal advocate at a domestic violence shelter or at a rape crisis center or sexual assault services center is that person can help bridge the gap between the legal system and the survivor. Even if they don't speak the same language, they can help. There's someone who's not a lawyer, and so there's someone that can help kind of bring the language out of the super legal words and language that we sometimes have to use. like just to give an example, here in Texas, the Texas law doesn't talk about custody, it talks about conservatorship, which can be a really foreign word to a lot of folks. And so explaining those concepts, the shelter advocate or someone who is kind of that extra step removed from the legal system, but still very much working closely with the survivor and developing that trusting and supportive relationship can really help bridge those gaps and can help the survivors navigate what can be sometimes a really arcane and complicated process just because of the nature of the legal system.
This is Jose Juan. Thank you, Caitlin. And I do want to also emphasize that even for native English speakers, as advocates, we are providing some form of language access in breaking down legalese or court orders into plain language, because what often happens is, and I think this is universal, we take a survivor or participant to meet the prosecutor or the legal aid attorney, and the legal aid attorney downloads all this processes and order protection, child custody or conservatorship or what have you. And then we go back to the office and, you know, just Maria is like, did you understand that? And Maria will say, no, I did not, right? Because there's so much technical jargon even within that conversation. And so us as advocates, even with native English speakers, we have to break down the legalese, police speak, even advocates speak. Sometimes we forget, right? So I just kind of also want to emphasize that a little bit, which is a good segue into, but before we go into the next part, is just want to check in if our colleagues here had any other additional thoughts for this question around those significant challenges legal service providers face in this conversation to enhance access. Just want to check in before moving on.
No, please, Payal, go ahead.
Thank you, Araceli. This is Payal. One thing that I wanted to say, like I echo with both of the fantastic colleagues that we have here that they said. One thing I also noticed is that, you know, we as service providers definitely have to look at it from our lens and take a step back, right? We always talk about we need qualified interpreter, you know, and have the best interpreter possible. But I think we should also think about what trainings we as a staff are getting so that we can sense what are the challenges in the room, right? We have to invest in that. We have to understand that we mean or should not be using bilingual speakers as an interpreter because the roles are very different, right? An interpreter role has to do with the code of ethics, and you know they are comfortable doing that because that's their role. But we have often seen that sometimes we just use a bilingual advocate to like interpret for you. I myself use a lot of interpreters, so we understand that the training that goes in for a staff member to use an interpreter is extremely crucial, and we sometimes miss that point. We are just so much focused on getting an interpreter that we forget that we as legal service providers, as Araceli mentioned, need to prepare ourselves for the meeting and share the scripts with them ahead of time and co-advocate. So I just wanted to flag that. I think it's the missing element that I see is that our staff needs to also be trained to be able to use interpreters in a manner that's more, you know, efficient for the interpreter as well as the client.
And just to put a plug for Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence, we actually have developed some fact sheets on how to work with interpreters. So we'll definitely provide that material at the end of this session. But you bring up a very good point, Payal, around training. So Robin, not to put you in the spot, but I'm wondering, like, what is the ABA Commission on Domestic and Sexual Violence providing for their members? Just in general, I mean, not just those legal service providers that specifically work with survivors around domestic violence and sexual assault, but just general practitioners who may be dealing with a divorce situation, but there's also domestic violence in the situation. Like, what are some of those strategies or support are you providing for those legal service providers that are not necessarily within this realm of the work? And not to put you in the spot.
This is Robin. Thank you for that question. So I understand you're asking about what resources there might be for attorneys who work with survivors offered through the American Bar Association.
Correct.
And
Yes.
work we do. Okay, so we've been around for a long time. I want to say 1994 or 5, but I could be wrong. And we've been providing training and technical assistance to attorneys who represent survivors of gender-based violence. Our projects vary, and we deeply appreciate and love to work with our partners like API-GBV, Deaf Hope, Tahare, and we've had some projects with TRLA as well, and we're so glad to have all of those components. Some of our grants include custody trainings, trainings on working with a survivor as they're going through the custody process, specific litigation skills. So litigation, or we call it lawyering skills, you know, how do you make an argument that centers your client's story and the experience that they're having so that a judge or a decision maker understands the situation and why a particular type of court order is needed. So we take on a lot of those components. We also have worked with many partners on trauma-informed legal services. So how, again, you know, I'm sure you won't be surprised to hear that not every law school teaches trauma-informed lawyering. Even though attorneys are often in a place with a person whose life is changing or they are experiencing challenges. And so we take it on as an important duty to work with attorneys to understand what it means to be trauma informed in every aspect of the work they do with survivors. We also have 2 grant projects right now, assisting attorneys who represent survivors, coalitions that work with survivors on working with LGBTQ survivors, and thinking about the things that their clients may be going through. We also train people in the criminal legal system and other systems on working with LGBTQ survivors. And we can always just be a resource for attorneys if they have questions. For example, I was able to pull the American Bar Association's ethical opinion on language access in the client-lawyer relationship. It's a little dense, but I'm happy to put in the link. Our National Professional Association's opinion on interpreter and language access, which of course I'm glad to report that's important, and it's important that confidentiality and information is protected within that relationship. But the only way for a client to really have the benefit of an attorney-client relationship is if they have that language access. So I could speak all day. We have publications and resources on, you know, establishing relationships with clients and writing retainer letters, which is like the agreement between an attorney and a client for moving forward in a case. But we are available to anyone who's on this call for any of those resources. Would you like me to put this in the chat, the ethics opinion?
This is Jose Juan. Yes, Robin, and we'll also share the link as part of the resources to the attendees here as well. And
All
thank
right,
you for
thank
that,
you.
Robin. Yes,
Oh.
thank you, Robin. So we're going to pivot a little, and now we're going to talk about addressing linguistic diversity, because I think a lot of times it's not just about, you know, what the law says around language access, which is important, but also as legal service providers and as advocates working together, the cultural responsiveness behind enhancing linguistic accessible legal services, right? And what does that mean? And so my next question to our amazing colleagues here is, how can legal service providers effectively engage with communities who speak in languages of lesser or limited diffusion to address language access barriers and provide culturally appropriate support for survivors? So I'm going to start off with Aracelia. I'm going to start off with you.
This is Aracelia, sure. So in my experience, I think the first thing is, how do legal organizations make their services accessible to deaf survivors in the community? The intake process. Before, for a while, I used to have paper. Like legal aid would give me a piece of paper, and then there's a referral form, right? So what does the survivor need? We'd fill out that paper, bring it back to legal aid, and then there would be a meeting. That was very effective. Then they changed their practice and their ways to now phone calls only and no paper form. So the client has to call. And I said, well, I need your services. And it'll be a recorded message saying, yes, we'll go ahead and record that information. And then I say, okay, well, let's call them back when we can. And it's like, well, no, it's not accessible. If you say to us, call us back when you can, you, the lawyer, because sometimes the deaf person might miss the call. Sometimes they might be an undocumented immigrant. They don't have access to a video phone because the FCC requires us as deaf consumers to provide a social security number in order to get a free video phone. And that could be available, and that could be a barrier for an undocumented deaf immigrant. So that's something that needs to be considered. And there are some organizations that might accept a VRI, a video remote interpreter, and there might be contracts for that, and you might get that for your appointment. And I have seen it, how awful and terrible that experience is. A deaf client can wait up to 30 to 45 minutes waiting for the interpreter to be connected because there is an internet connectivity issue, and then they have to reschedule that appointment. So I have to emphasize, this might be a high risk appointment. And so I encourage to have an interpreter in person. That is the best way that you can offer and make sure that there's least harm in order for communication to be effective. And it's really important for folks to also be mindful that when you are contracting with those video remote interpreters on screen, on an iPad or what have you, make sure you ask what agency they come from. Are they coming from a language bank agency, or are they coming from an agency that is used by the deaf community? Here, language banks that are out here, they don't have any strict screening processes to be able to have ASL interpreters join their agency. Some of them might be an ASL level 1 person or an ASL level 2 person. Maybe they learned ASL 3 or maybe 4 years ago, and then they'll say, hey, can you please come and interpret during a legal context setting? My goodness, talk about high risk situation and how that would cause incredible harm. So please use community-based agencies that are local in your area, and please have them come in person. That way, the interpreter can be there and in the space. And if they need different accommodations, then that hearing interpreter can say, you know what, we need a deaf interpreter in the room. And so there are just several different ways that legal advocates and lawyers can please simply be proactive in how to prepare that ahead of time to provide services, for interpretation. Some will think, well, we have video remote interpreting. That's checking off a box. That's access. That's accommodations. But there have been so many problems that have come with that. So I think that's just a good way to start in terms of making sure that you have access being had. I also do just want to mention that there are some grassroots folks that might be confused by interpreters, deaf folks. And this is a true story. There was a deaf survivor who needed to go to court for a very serious crime. And the consequences were that they would have to serve time. So the judge then asked the deaf person, are you guilty? The deaf person said, well, yes. The judge said, okay. And so they proceeded. But with that situation, there was a hearing interpreter, no certified deaf interpreter. So that deaf person did time. That deaf person who was then in prison met with a deaf advocate, had a chat regarding their experience. And the deaf advocate said, why did you plead guilty? Why did you confess that? And the deaf person said, no, I never said that. I never pled guilty. I thought the judge was asking me if my name was George. This is my sign name, G on my chest. This also, folks, is the same sign for guilty. The hearing interpreter didn't catch that and didn't know that. And so that's why we always encourage having a certified deaf interpreter. And if you had a deaf interpreter in the room, that deaf interpreter would have said, no, that doesn't mean guilty. That is his name. That is his sign name. And that's what he was asking. And that deaf interpreter could have asked for more information to elaborate from the deaf person. So that is the cultural responsiveness that we're talking about, those cultural nuances that hearing interpreters may not always have. A certified deaf interpreter is a native heritage sign language user. We want those deaf interpreters in the room because they can catch those facial expressions and can catch those nuances that only they could, that a hearing interpreter might not be able to. So I'll pause there for now. Thank you for the question.
This is Jose Juan. I gotta say, I've heard you share that story before, and every time I hear it, it makes me so angry sometimes. Maybe I shouldn't say that, but it just upsets me so, because again, as I referenced before, language access is more than just providing the process. It's also a human strength and practice, right? It's also understanding that even within sign language, there's nuances to how the sign language is being used. And like you mentioned, Aracelia, before, people may have developed their own form of sign language and people may not understand it and so on. So thank you for sharing that. So Payal, I'm going to turn to you for this question. Like, how can legal service providers effectively engage with communities who speak in languages of limited or lesser diffusion to address language access barriers?
Hi, this is Payal. I think a couple of things that I'm going to just simply put it. It's not a lot of effort, but it's about understanding what your role as a lawyer is, right? Be prepared for your meetings, right? I have heard often this from a lot of service providers. So we don't see the specific culture calling us or the specific language, individuals calling us, because they were victimized. And I'm like, why is that happening? Right? Are we doing the outreach in that community? Just because we don't have the resources doesn't mean that it's not happening, right? So that's like one thing that I've time and again heard, that, oh, we don't get, that community members a lot. So going back to what I was saying, like, be prepared, be patient, be prepared. When I say be prepared, simplify the language when you're going in for an interview, right, with your client. Have simple questions, use layman term, don't use legalese, right? That's just what we do in interviews. But also, like, when we are connecting with the clients, we use often language lines. They're not the best. So just make sure when we are using language line, the purpose of language line is very limited, right? Just making sure that they understand what the time of appointment is, and that's it. And maybe that's all we can do. And then make sure that we have interpreters, in person, as Aracelia was saying, or on a video call if it's really difficult for the client to come in, right? But then there are like technological challenges. Do we know that, that client that we are serving has, proper place to be able to take that video call? Do we know that, the client that we are serving is able to connect with that video call, like have the technology and the resources to be able to navigate what you are thinking is the best, right? So there are a lot of challenges, but we work through them. We make sure that there are, enough partnership that we have built up within the community, to able to access the resources. One of the partners that Tahrir has is Asian Women's Shelter, and they have an incredible multilingual access program, and they have language access plan as well. So we definitely look up to them for a lot of access and, education and training model that they have already pre-created that we can use and absorb, while we maintain our own interpreter list, while we maintain our own translators list, right? As Arasalga was saying, right? Like, I think we need to make sure, like, have a screening question when we have those internal lists, right? People reach out to us from community that they want to be volunteering with us, but we also are very conscious in making sure that there are paid interpreters, certified interpreters available, which are pre-screened, have certification, and we do a lot of feedback. So when we engage with them, we also engage with the client with other interpreters just to get feedback. Like, did you understand everything, right? And we try to keep initial meetings very short. So like, those are some of the things that we adopt, which are simplistic, but it takes time. But just know that it is going to take time, and you make time for it, because it's really important for someone to understand what you are saying, but also you to understand if it all makes sense for them. Because our role is to provide services to them. If it's not comfortable for them, they're gonna turn away. They're not gonna come back. And then they will have this fear instilled in them that, if I go to some other agency, it's gonna happen to me again. So the onus is on us to make sure that we are being very mindful as to what we are doing and what we are absorbing as an agency, as a service provider.
This is Jose Juan. Thank you so much. And Caitlin, same question to you, as a legal service provider, working with advocates, how can our colleagues or legal service providers effectively engage with communities who speak in languages of limited or lesser diffusion?
Yes, this is Caitlin. I'm going to echo a word that both Pyle and Aracelia used, which was being proactive or preparing and making a plan. Because if you're trying to provide the most trauma-informed services that you can to someone, you really want to at least have a plan in place as to how you're going to locate these resources at the moment that someone walks through your door or contacts your agency. Because if somebody, you're not going to know necessarily that somebody, for example, needs a certified deaf interpreter until they come and seek services, but you don't want to have them then sitting in your lobby for like 2.5 hours while you try and figure out how are you going to access these resources or where you're going to find them. And so as much as you can, trying to identify what resources are available, think through, make a plan, make sure that your receptionists or the folks that are receiving folks know how to access those resources. And then also thinking through how your information gets out in the community. As Pyle mentioned, often it's not that, folks out there don't need help, but maybe they don't know how to access our resources. And so thinking about if there's maybe a space to use a translation program on your website or on your other materials, not materials that you distribute, but at least on your website, so that there's basic information out there about your agency and about the services that it provides in the survivor's language, so that they can understand what you do and what you can maybe assist them with when they're looking at resources that might be available in their community. I think another really important consideration when you're working with survivors who speak other languages, in particular languages of lesser diffusion, is time. It's going to take time to work with folks who speak a foreign language. Just the physical time it takes to do relay interpretation or whatever might be necessary, but there's probably also going to be additional time needed to prepare for hearings, for the actual court, if you're going to have a court hearing, for the actual court hearing itself. I know there was a question submitted by a lot of the attendees about how to make sure that court interpreters or interpreters in court-like settings are interpreting well and are qualified and things like that. I think one of the best ways to at least try and gauge if you're not able to speak the survivor's language is practice with the survivor. Review with their information, of course, making sure that you're not re-traumatizing them, making sure that it's in a supportive space with the time and the space that they need to do this. But if you practice with them and work through and take the time to learn their story and the information they need to communicate, then that will help you know when all of a sudden there's something else being talked about in court, or something that doesn't seem to match with what you've discussed with the survivor before, so that you can try and identify some of those issues. Especially if you're dealing with a language where it's very low diffusion and you might not be able to have, an advocate or a community member who could come and attend the hearing and at least listen for things that might sound or observe for things that might not be interpreted correctly. But by taking that practice and working with the survivor and taking that time, I think it will really help prepare both you as the advocate and the survivor as someone who needs to be able to tell their story and communicate their information to these other agencies or to the court system, and be able to do that in a way that is both trauma informed, but also make sure that you're supporting them in their language.
So Robin, just wondering, from your perspective from the ABA Commission on Domestic and Sexual Violence, what are some of the things that y'all are doing, again, same question, to make sure that survivors who use languages of limited or lesser diffusion to make sure that legal service providers have those abilities or are able to provide those services?
This is Robin. Thank you for the question. Because we do work around the country, I think it can vary depending upon the community involved. One piece that we hope to be able to provide to legal services providers is helping them think through language access plans and kind of going towards that planning again. I was going to say the same thing, preparation and planning. I can say from someone who practiced in a rural jurisdiction for about 15 years, I recognize that sometimes it can feel challenging because resources might be a little different than they are in other communities, but truly it's the same approach, right? Knowing your community, and what we like to encourage legal services providers to think about is, are you engaged in the community you work with? Are you thinking from every level of access that a client has to how they're able to access it? And is it accessible to everyone? Or is it accessible just to the people who are able to easily access services, may not need interpreters or additional assistance to find your office, all of those things. And so we try to ask legal programs to think about not just providing the same access to everyone, but access that actually makes a difference to survivors, if that makes sense. And so we're working individually with organizations to do that. And then again, if it is an issue coming up where an organization or an attorney would like to work more deeply on a plan, we're happy to field that and start working with you. And then we probably will reach out to API-GBV and other folks who provide these services as well. And we think about a lot, and I think this will be something that'll continue to come up, is the importance of protecting survivor information and thinking about how a survivor needs to be able to give informed consent before their information is shared. And from the very moment that they meet with you or access your services, they know that regardless of the process that might need to be gone through to access, we're not going to share their information in an unauthorized way. So those are all things that we think about and we ask legal programs to think about as well.
This is also fun. Thank you, Robin. And again, shameless plug here. Language. Do you have a language access plan? That's the biggest question we always ask when people reach out to us for technical assistance. Do you have a language access plan? Like it's already been mentioned here by several of our colleagues, is being prepared, being responsive, not reactive, not wait for the situation to happen and then scramble to find the resource. So build relationships, reach out to somebody. There's plenty of experts here that are willing and want to help, right? Because we're in the business of saving lives. At the end of the day, whether you're a lawyer, you're a lawyer providing services for victims of crime or survivors of crime, in this case, gender-based violence crime, advocates, we are in the business of saving lives. And the impact of not providing language access, as has already been mentioned, is misinterpretation of words, of language, assuming that Spanish is universally used everywhere, sign language is universally used everywhere. And so again, we're about saving lives. Otherwise, people are going to lose custody of their children and maybe even lose their lives. So again, just kind of bringing that to this space. So we're going to do another pivot in this conversation, because as I mentioned before, the other area of conversation is just looking at the impact of geographic location. And, growing up as an advocate in a border town like Brownsville, Texas, where right across is Mexico, because everyone kind of looked like me, and most of us spoke Spanish to some degree of fluency, proficiency, I took for granted language access, right? But also within that aspect, there were some benefits to that, because we also had I would say, an abundance of immigration attorneys, right? Or legal aid attorneys that spoke Spanish, which was the predominant language in my service area. So I took for granted. And it wasn't until recent years, probably in the last 8 years of doing national work, that I understood the importance of having a court certified interpreter at the legal hearing, or having just interpreters at any process where the legal rights of victims of crime are being discussed, right? And what does it look like? So my question for our amazing colleagues here is, especially we're going to start off with border towns, and I'm looking at you, Caitlin, is like in border towns where there may be a unique mix of languages and legal systems, as I've mentioned, what strategies can legal providers employ to ensure effective language access for survivors?
Yes, this is Caitlin. So I practice in Laredo, Texas, which is on the US-Mexico border across from Nuevo Laredo, Mexico. And so I think one of the biggest things is recognizing the need for certified court interpreters. A lot of folks, myself included, are bilingual, but I would never feel comfortable, interpreting for a client in a court hearing. It certainly facilitates me being able to speak Spanish with my clients and have those conversations with them. But I think recognizing the limits and recognizing the need for those folks who have that experience is really important. I think it's also really important, I have many clients who have grown up on both sides of the border. They speak English and Spanish, but Spanish is their preferred language. But working with clients to help them recognize that even though they can speak English, I have some clients who will say, oh, I'm fine to just do the court hearing, or I'm fine to just go and have that interview or whatever it is in English. But helping them recognize the need to be able to do these things in their native language, because, it's very different understanding a question like, what is your name? Or, what are your kids' names versus maybe the cross-examination question from opposing counsel that is already meant to trip you up and is maybe in a language that's not your native language. I think also something we potentially encounter a little bit more here on the border is a need for certified folks who do certified written translation as well, because with clients living their lives on both sides of the border, they potentially have documents from both sides of the border. Maybe they have a divorce decree from Mexico or custody orders or whatever it might be. And so not only being able to translate those documents, but these are legal documents we're talking about that again come with that kind of extra level of language complexity. And I think also something is just familiar as much as you can. We as an agency try to familiarize ourselves with cultural practices on both sides of the border, recognizing especially differences in our legal systems or differences in our professionals that may create like pitfalls or tripping up for clients. One kind of classic example is notaries versus notarios. For those of you that may not be familiar with the concept of a notario, this is a licensed professional in Mexico that in many ways can do work a lot like an attorney. They can do things like participate in a mediation, potentially issue certain decrees and things like that. And many people will use kind of the word notario and notary public that we have here in the United States similarly, but notaries here in the United States are much different. Their capacities are much more limited. And so, understanding those differences can help explain to clients why, for example, wanting to go to a notary for your immigration paperwork or for your taxes or whatever it might be is maybe not the best idea, even though that's what you would do across in Mexico, because the words are interchangeable and they maybe don't understand the difference. And so helping by having an understanding of those differences and understanding of those differences in cultural norms can help clients navigate these potential pitfalls when they're working on when they want to go forward with the case.
This is Jose Juan. Thank you, Caitlin. And again, this is specifically resonance with me, again, being from a border town and having advocated with survivors with all of these legal layers of dynamics that you mentioned, Caitlin. So I'm just gonna also offer the same question to Aracelia and Payal, like, what has been your experience? I know Tahrir Justice Center has offices in Houston, they have an office in Texas. So, what has been your experience around just working with survivors who may be living in a border town or come from a border town with some of these issues that Caitlin mentioned? So, Payal, we'll start with you and then with Aracelia.
Sounds good. Hi, I am Payal. I think the experience are very similar as what Caitlin mentioned, right? We still have our practice is mainly immigration. So thankfully, we have court interpreters in the court, but when USCIS interviews happen, we don't have interpreters and we have to bring our own interpreters, right? And there's a dearth of interpreters. So we rely a lot on like having a language access plan, having certified interpreters. We need to like pre-screen them. And we also believe in something, not reinventing the wheel, right? So we rely on community partners and what they have created, and they are verified, because if you are working with survivors, it takes a community to actually provide that holistic services to them, right? So we don't have to figure out everything on our own. We work with our community, partners to build that program up, right? And it's challenging, it's scary, right? When someone has gone through so much, their journey is already so traumatic, and the way they are being treated in the country by the officials where they came to seek protection, it's extremely scary. And so keeping that in mind and being patient while you're navigating what their needs are, what their priorities are, I think our attorneys have learned that definitely making sure that when they are in these spaces, using the terms that they understand, that our client understand, is really, really important. For example, we often use our service provider safety planning. What does that mean? They don't know, right? So breaking it down and connecting where they are at is really important. So we really rely on our community partnership, have a language access plan. When we have a language access plan, we also make sure that we are engaging all staff levels, internally and externally, right? So like I was saying, that we don't want to reinvent the wheel. So if they have something that really works for everyone, then we just absorb that, adapt it the way it works for our clients, right? That's something we definitely rely on. And I think lastly, I would just say that we do a lot of advocacy and policy initiatives. So we have a policy program, right? We have a policy director. We do a lot of advocacy to make sure that, if there are loopholes, we are able to be in the stakeholder meetings to raise that. For example, when we have to take our interpreter for interviews, official interviews, we want to make sure that this is a service that should be provided by the interviewers, rather than putting the burden back on a survivor who is already navigating so many things to actually find an interpreter while they are trying to understand and figuring out what's happening to them. So we do a lot of policy advocacy initiative at that end as well. These are some of the things that we do at Tahrir. And we actually also believe in something that once we create like AVA, we rely on them for a lot of materials, but then also we believe in like resource sharing, right? Because it's not something mine that I created. It's something that's for everyone, and brainstorm and have that conversation.
Thank you. This was Juan. Aracelia?
Yes, I agree with everything that Paella just shared. This is Aracelia. My experience really, I've noticed that. I noticed that there needs to be time to sit with a deaf survivor. And guess what, folks? It's going to be double or triple the time required to work with a deaf client versus a hearing person. Maybe a hearing person, you get an hour. A deaf survivor might need 2 to 3 hours. Be prepared for that. It might be the same information that the hearing person and the deaf person is giving, but deaf people need more time. The interpreting process takes time. Translation process of documents takes time. And I myself, it takes me 4 to 6 appointments for me to get the whole story from the deaf client, because some of their signing I might not be able to have access to or understand quite well. For instance, there was one who kept signing this. And I was like, I wonder what this is. What does that mean? And I was struggling to understand until finally this client showed me a computer wire and showed me this. And they were trying to say the Wi-Fi. And that by itself took me 30 minutes to figure out what that sign was. And so again, I think the time spent of trying to understand the survivor and their choice of signs and how they're explaining concepts and their experiences and their receptive process to understand me and then for us together to go into a court setting or into a legal appointment. That's where I say, okay, these are the things that we've got, but this is the way that we've been communicating, and then how to translate and interpret that information. We want to make sure that that's accessible to the survivor. Sometimes the interpreters will come in, those interpreters, again, it's still not accessible because they may not be qualified to understand for the deaf client. If there's a team of a certified deaf interpreter and a hearing interpreter, then great. If there's still some misunderstanding or uncertainty, we do role play, we do pictures, we draw pictures, we act out the concepts. And so it takes that much time and elaboration to be able to make sure that the client understands, okay, this is what's happening, this is the process, or just to provide information so that the deaf client can have access to that. It requires just time and patience on the provider's end. So that's just really, really critical. I've also noticed some attorneys will just write summaries of the meeting or a summation of here's what it is to communicate something, and it's quite lengthy and it's a dense piece of information. And the deaf client will look at that and feel overwhelmed and go, what does this long thing mean? And so that's something also to consider too, the length of your summations. And sometimes it's certainly beneficial because then the advocate can then read it. But if the attorney is not willing to if that's because there are some attorneys who are not willing to have their advocate like me to sit beside them, then I have to over here out the gaps and figure out the holes in the communication. So sometimes I really, really just ask and encourage to please allow the co-advocacy approach to take place. It will allow for time to just be more efficient for the deaf survivor. So just make sure that the deaf client doesn't fall through the cracks, or there might be missing information. So yeah, those are just my thoughts for right now. But yeah, thank you for the question.
This is Jose Juan. Thank you, Aracelia. Pausing here for interpreter change. Thank you. This is Jose Juan again. Thank you, Aracelia, for that thought. And just also, so many things going through my mind. And a lot of things that you mentioned, Aracelia, we see across the board for anyone, like limited English speakers, as well as survivors who use different modes of communication, right? And just trying to figure out, like for limited English speakers, does that legal term exist? Can we interpret or translate that legal term into that language? Even languages of limited or lesser diffusion, right? And just like you mentioned, Aracelia, it's going to take more time. If you think it's just gonna require more time, right? Because you're not only you're doing sight translation and interpretation, you're reading documents, you're breaking down the language as an advocate if you're bilingual in that language, or you sign for that person. It's just gonna take time, right? And so what I'm hearing is just patience. Patience. And again, really reiterating the fact that when we provide language access, it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be simple. But if we have a plan, if we have collaborations, if we're willing to learn some of the cultural nuances of how that language is used, like the Spanish language in different areas of the world, we might get a better sense of communication. And we know based on research that when we provide services in language or in the preferred mode of communication, the level of anxiety and stress goes down for survivors. I can attest that for a fact, because when I am working with survivors and when I was an advocate in my hometown crisis center and I would speak to them in Spanish, physically they would relax. Like literally their shoulders would just drop down. Defenses drop. I still had to earn their trust, because by the time they get to the crisis center, they've been referred to 10 gazillion places in the courtroom, going to notary publics or whatever, never getting a straight answer. But when they finally get to someone who actually is able to communicate in language, culturally, it just changes the spectrum, right? And so, again, just kind of being thoughtful and mindful of those things, because I'm here to ask you all, it's like, for those of us who are native English speakers, how many times have we had to call customer service because we didn't understand the instructions of assembling something, a piece of furniture, and it's in English? So what's the problem? It's because those instructions are not in plain language. I'm like, they're I mean, at least for me, I have issues with putting things together. Or even just looking at medical records, right? When we have our own medical lab work done, I don't understand what I don't have to go to a professional who understands values and whatever so they can explain to me in plain language what this means in my medical lab work, right? So again, just being mindful how even in the English language, there has to be language access. Okay, so we've kind of gone over all our questions, I think. And there's been a lot of energy happening in the chat. So before we go to the chat and answering some of these questions that have been already provided by some of the attendees, I just want to kind of check in with the panelists and see if there's any last minute aha moments you had, just having these conversations before we go to the chat or the questions that were provided beforehand. If not, yes.
Actually have something. As Araceli was saying that to be patient, I wanted to share something that happened with us too very recently. And we had like a Spanish interpreter, and then we had to have a mom interpreter because the mom interpreter could only interpret from Spanish to mom. And then the person who was attending the client could only speak English. So we had like 4 people: the client, the mom interpreter, the Spanish interpreter, and the attorney. And it just goes to what Arcelia was saying, that we had to prepare ourselves. We take a step back. We wanted to simplify it. And as Jose, you were saying, right? If you don't speak the language, you have to make that extra effort because, you spoke Spanish and someone felt comfortable. It's additional burden on you when you don't speak the language to make sure that they are comfortable speaking with you, right? And having 2 other people in with you, how do you do that? And I just want to emphasize on the fact that it's our responsibility to ensure that first meeting is not, let's figure this out, is to take time and be patient and just see how comfortable you can make the client, because that's the trust building relationship, right? And if they trust you, then they can work with you, and then they can actually tell you like, hey, this is not working. And how do we gauge that? I think one of the things that I also wanted to highlight is that we have our whole intake. At Araceli was saying, we have our whole intake. We want to know everything. But when your answers are short and you're not getting, then even if you don't speak the language and you are using an interpreter, know that there's something wrong, right? Or give everyone a breather and try it with someone else to just have that conversation. I'm just going to leave it on that because I felt like I use a lot of interpreters, and this is something important to share with everyone, that we all will have challenges, and it's very different and it's very tricky, but I think we need to rely on just making sure that we have the trust with the client and we will figure this out.
This is Jose Juan. Thank you, Payal. I think you make an excellent point. And also, part of language access is the way certain communities communicate. Some of us talk in story because that is how we were raised. We talk in storytelling. And sometimes, having been an advocate and, recruiting pro bono lawyers, sometimes the lawyers would get a little bit frustrated because, okay, just give me the answer. I'm like, you're going to get the answer. I promise you're going to get the answer, but But also, if you're open to the story, you're going to get a lot of context to the violence. I promise you that you are going to do that. But I think this is also where co-advocacy that Aracelia mentioned comes into play, because I, as the advocate who may be identifying as bicultural and bilingual, can kind of bridge some of those storytelling communications and maybe condense them to some extent, right? But still be trauma informed, because sometimes in the storytelling, there's healing happening, right? And certainly being mindful that you as a lawyer, I don't want you to be the therapist or the counselor. I get that. But I also understand that if you're going to be a legal practitioner representing victims of crime, you have to provide trauma-informed legal representation, period. Again, it doesn't mean that you have to be the therapist, but if you understand when you talk and provide the legal advice, communicating legal options or whatever it is you're doing as a lawyer, it's so much different. And when you do this with as co-advocacy or with an advocate, you actually help the process a little bit more. But also understanding that I have to understand my role as the advocate and the role of the lawyer. And although we work together, we have to be mindful and respectful of each other's limitations and where we're willing to work together, right? Because we all, as lawyers, you have licensure and you want to be mindful of that. Some of us as advocates may be licensed social workers or what have you, and so we want to be mindful of that. Anyone else, any other additional thoughts before we go into the audience portion of the show, as I like to say? Aracelia.
Yeah, this is Aracelia here. Just a really quick point. As an advocate, as an attorney, as a service provider, when we work with a survivor who maybe recently moved to the States and they're undocumented, I often put in the effort in really explaining the information beyond what they are receiving. Because we are essentially gatekeepers to information, right? They are craving for information often. And so for me, when there's a lawyer or attorney who provides that information that they've provided from them, I expand and I elaborate on that and go, why that is important, why this is essential, and what the purpose of this is, and what the next steps are. Because I want this deaf client to be able to understand how the lawyer got to that decision, why did that attorney get to that particular choice. And so being able to elaborate with the client, the deaf client will go, oh, okay, I see that. And they understand the process a lot better. And I've noticed that that has been incredibly helpful, especially with the process of trust. I mean, the barriers that the systems have are they only get bits and pieces of information, and then they're often left in the dark. And so we really, really make sure we take time to expand on what the information there is. And so I think that's a really important part in the trust building, for sure, with the deaf survivor. So I just wanted to throw that out there as an important tip to be mindful of.
This is Jose Juan. Thank you, Aracelia. So if there's no more conversation from the panelists, we'll go ahead and move to some of the questions in the chat or comments. So there's one here for Aracelia. They're asking, can Aracelia speak more about grassroots American Sign Language, and if there is a recognized way to understand someone who speaks something that is a non-standard sign language, or even just specific to that person and their family?
This is Aracelia here. I think it's hard for an attorney to make that type of observation. Sometimes interpreters will immediately say, we need a CDI. A hearing interpreter will say, we need a certified deaf interpreter. That's why I really encourage having an advocate, a deaf advocate, be part of the process, because the deaf advocate will be able to say, you need a certified deaf interpreter, rather than at the appointment. If you have an advocate with that deaf person, that advocate will already know that, because otherwise you'll have to reschedule and then get a team of interpreters in the room. So I strongly feel that an deaf advocate can really provide that cultural context and those cultural nuances to allow for a better process to be more efficient and effective for the attorney. But if you are in a situation where there's no advocate, you're like, there's no advocate here in our area, we don't have a deaf advocate here, that is of course the challenging piece, right? And I'm aware of that. However, certified deaf interpreter will be able to provide background information and go, okay, are you an ASO user? Or maybe they'll need to do more visual gestural communication and act information out. And that requires time, which means you might need to book additional time. You might think an hour is enough, but the CDI will say it will take me 3 hours to act out each part of this process. So please book 3 hours. So again, first is find a deaf organization so that you can have a deaf advocate in that process from the beginning, so that you can effectively be able to make the right moves and decisions moving forward. Because you might get a certified deaf interpreter who actually might not be qualified. And there might be some cultural nuances that's significant to mention. Maybe a certified deaf interpreter might be able to use ASO, yes, but to work with a survivor who might be an immigrant, who may not have any language, that might not be that particular CDI's expertise. There's another CDI in the field who might have that expertise. So again, work with a deaf advocate from the beginning if you can.
This is Jose Juan. Thank you, Aracelia. So next question in the chat is, do you have any knowledge of interpreters who can be in person with clients when you, as their legal representation, have to connect with your clients remotely due to the constraints of your program? Let me repeat the question again. Do you have any as their legal representation have to connect with your clients remotely due to the constraints of your program? Either of the lawyers on the panel want to answer that?
I just wanted to understand and clarify. So I'm reading this question as, or understanding this question as, that when the legal representative have to connect with the client remotely, and they would want their interpreter to be present with the client. If I don't know if it's in a court setting, because if that's the court setting, an immigration court, you can appear via WebEx, which is a remote representation, and the client can be in the court and there are court interpreters. So that's a possibility. But if it's due to like a pre-court work, right? Let's say if I have to do an intake, or I have to get a declaration, or any of that sort, what we prefer, because we work with survivors, we want to make sure that their safety is our priority. So let's say if I am sick and I am at home and I'm working through Zoom, I would make sure that the survivor has a space and a room for them to be able to sit in, so that they are not releasing information to their family members or anyone else, right? And they are able to come to our office, and we have office representatives in our office to be able to like have that communication. And then we also have invested in laptops so that they are able to access laptop, where even if they don't know how the technology works, there is someone who can set them up for it, and we can do that interview with them when they are in Zoom. And yes, we are able to get the interpreter in office, if that's the question, and that's how I understood it.
This is Jose Juan. Thank you. Caitlin, would you like to respond to the question?
Yeah, this is Caitlin. I understood the question similarly to, I guess, Pyle's understanding. I think also this is another circumstance of trying to identify resources and things that are available beforehand, if at all possible, and really meeting the survivor where they are. Whether it's, both including with their preferred method of communication, including their preferred language. If the survivor is wanting someone there in person, then doing what you can to try and facilitate that. But if it's a circumstance where they are fine with, for example, doing like a Zoom meeting and having the interpreter be present also remotely, through the tools that Zoom or other kind of video meeting services have, really following the survivor's lead and what they think is going to be best for them, and doing what you can to facilitate their preferred method of communication.
This
This
is
is
Juan.
Tomiko.
Oh, yes, Tomiko, I'm
Sorry,
sorry.
I just wanted to clarify. I think that this question came up when Aracelia was talking about best practices in terms of having an in-person interpreter. And so I think there are maybe some details that might be different when considering sign language interpreters. Just wanted to clarify the question.
This is Arcelia. Yes, when you're in a rural region where the interpreter pool is quite limited and very small, that's a challenge, period. And that's common. It's common in the US, where we as a team would need to brainstorm and think about what the options are available. We do, of course, talk to the survivor. We say, what are they comfortable with? Absolutely. Sometimes the survivor themselves might say, well, comfortable with a hearing interpreter on Zoom. Okay, that's fine. But maybe the certified deaf interpreter, okay, if you have one and they're available, you can also use a DI, a deaf interpreter. A deaf interpreter simply means that they're not quite certified yet, or not officially certified yet by a formal interpreting agency or entity. Let me give a little bit of background first. Right now, agencies that provide certified procedures for court interpreting is now on hold. So many court sign language interpreters are suffering, and especially in California, we are struggling. We only have, what, 3 certified deaf interpreters in the entire state of California. That's how small our pool is. And so it's certainly a challenge that we're navigating through, and we're mindful of that. That's why, because of those limitations, if the certified deaf interpreter is not available, a deaf interpreter might be available. Okay. And if they're comfortable with that, now I have seen in the courtroom where they can't find 2 certified deaf interpreters. So what they have done is they've brought in 1 court certified interpreter into the space with a community deaf interpreter into the space as well. And that certified interpreter will observe the conversation, observe the interpretation. That's kind of the Band-Aid strategy that we've been using in the California courts. And so for community meetings, you know, with attorneys, I would say, are you comfortable with the DI? Are you comfortable with that? And I will look and be on the hunt to look for a deaf interpreter who might be a best fit for that conversation or for that space, to match the cultural nuances and just be culturally responsive with what that deaf client needs. And of course, we'll say who they are. We'll maybe show a video of their signing and ask the deaf client, are you comfortable with that? And the deaf client says, yeah, I understand them. They're clear. Sometimes they'll show and go, do you understand them? The deaf client will go, no, I'm having a hard time understanding them. So that doesn't work, right? So being able to show and do that pre-homework work, right, is really important to get their comfort level. And you have to explain, okay, this is the interpreting situation. This is what it is. But you say, I am committed to being adjusting and to figure out how we can accommodate for the survivor's needs. And we have tried to think outside the box. And I think that's what we have to do, is use a community interpreter who a community person who is not an interpreter. This was a low risk situation. The survivor was completely fine with it. We asked them if it was okay. They said it was fine. And so, you know, it was good, because if we said, well, it has to be a certified interpreter, that wouldn't have worked. We need to ask and make sure, what's the best way for the survivor to get this information? And if it's working with a community member, then it's working with a community member. Maybe it's holding off on getting someone who's certified. Maybe we have to be a little bit flexible with that notion of just only getting certified interpreters. So look at the deaf client, ask for what they feel. If the resources are not available or they're scarce, then please consider the community that's around you.
This is Jose Juan. Thank you, Aracelia. Oh, it's popping. The answers are popping. The conversation is happening. I love that. I'm gonna go to another question regarding accountability. What are the best practices for determining if an organization is providing meaningful language access, even if an organization has language access plan, they're interested in the next step? Would anyone like to take I could answer that, but you are the invited guest. So yeah, anyone would like to take an answer or respond to that?
This is Caitlin. I think, you know, once you've established the plan, if we're thinking about what it means to have a meaningful plan, I think is really about knowing your community and about knowing your client population. And so thinking about, as I mentioned before, how you make the information about your agency available to folks who speak other languages. And thinking about what are going to be the most common languages or alternative forms of communication that you're going to encounter in your local community. I think this is also a space that can help facilitate, in a particularly rural area, that co-advocacy can really help, I think, facilitate a survivor being able to access services, with the caveat that if you're in a rural community with a survivor that speaks a much rarer language in your area, it's going to be very, very important to protect information about that survivor and make sure you're getting informed consent. Because if you mention that this is a person that speaks, such and such language, maybe there's only one family in your area that speaks that language. And so it's going to be very easy to identify who that person is. And so making sure you do what you can to facilitate access to those languages, but also protect the survivor's information. And if you're going to share information or refer someone or whatever it might be, having that conversation with the survivor and making sure you get their informed consent as part of that process.
This is Jose Juan. Thank you, Caitlin. Araceli or Payal, would you like to respond to that?
Sorry, this is the interpreter who was struggling with unmuting. What was the question again? This is for Aracelia. Could you repeat the question again?
Yes, regarding accountability, what are best practices for determining if an organization is providing meaningful language access, even if an org has a language access plan?
Got it. Thank you so much for repeating that. This is Aracelia. I think that once you've established a language access plan, that's wonderful. But now looking at contracts and looking at getting interpreters from the community, I think creating a list, as I think it was already mentioned, get a list of interpreters. Are they local? And get interpreters who can, in fact, interpret on Zoom. Get that list ready. Have a list of CDI interpreters ready, and deaf interpreters who are in the process of getting certification. Have those lists ready. And you could say, this was recommended by Deaf Hope. This was recommended by another deaf agency in the area. That way, when it's ready and the time comes, you have that list ready. And it's much more convenient for you to be able to go, okay, we have this list. Let's go ahead and contact them, right? To make that process more efficient. Because I also just want to mention too that, to recommend sometimes out-of-state interpreters on Zoom, because say, for example, the survivor doesn't want to have interpreters that are local for obvious reasons. Maybe they're well connected, maybe that deaf client's well known, and to have interpreters work with them, they're like, I don't want that interpreter to know that information. I'd rather do Zoom. That way we can get an interpreter out of state to be able to be in this conversation and interpret. So that's always something to think about too. Yes, get interpreters in person, but give that survivor options and say, would you like someone in person? Would you like someone on Zoom? And if that client's saying, no, it doesn't matter to me, it's okay. But that client might say, I had a bad experience with so-and-so and so-and-so, please don't bring them in. It's like, okay. And you make a note of that. And maybe you've looked throughout the list, you've looked throughout that list of interpreters and they're all booked. Because the top-notch interpreters tend to be booked 2 weeks in advance. And if it's a last-minute appointment, it might be hard to get those preferred interpreters. And maybe the advocate says, well, we got an interpreter from the agency. What about that name? And maybe the advocate, I know that person, that interpreter is not a good fit for this client. Trust the advocate. Code of ethics says that, the interpreters need to be ethical, that when they book an assignment, they want to make sure that the interpreters know that, okay, that they might be a good fit. If the deaf client is an immigrant and maybe that interpreter doesn't have any immigration experience, then they should not book that appointment. But some hearing interpreters don't have that consideration. They're just, oh yeah, I can do any job. I could just come in and interpret anything. It's like, no, they're not qualified and they have no business being here. So it's really important to get an interpreter who is knowledgeable of social justice practices, immigration processes, DVSV work, that whole sphere, and who gets it, who has trauma-informed language in their work. And when you have that, man, does that interpretation look different than someone who does not have that information and that background? So yeah, those are just some tools and some tips.
This is Jose Juan. Thank you, Araceli. And I think just from an accountability perspective, from an organizational perspective, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act says, and Executive Order 13166 clarifies that if you receive any type of federal, state, government funding, you are to provide language access, which means developing a language access plan, which means looking at your budget allocations every year, right? How much money are you allocating or prioritizing a line item on your budget to invest in hiring qualified, certified interpreters and translation services, building training for your staff, maybe hiring bilingual staff as part of your organization, and maybe incentivizing that as as part of hiring, because being bilingual is a skill, but you also have to create a system of assessing their proficiency and fluency in that language that people proclaim that they are able to speak or write in. For example, when I used to work at a previous job, it was a statewide legal nonprofit. I was part of the interviewing process when attorneys were applying for jobs at the organization. And towards the end of the interview, I would conduct it in Spanish because that was the language that was being required. And the deer in headlights I would get, I'm like, I am sorry, but if you're claiming that in your resume, I'm going to test the skill. Because as a nonprofit legal service provider who works and represents victims of crime, in providing legal options or legal advice in language is very critical. So don't mess around in your resume. Do not claim things that you do not know or haven't been assessed in doing. So I think some of the things, just organizationally speaking, also as an organization, as far as accountability, what we also recommend is you have to have decision makers in that space. Directors, people who are actually building the budgets for the organizations. What we recommend is create a group internally of the organization that addresses not only issues around language access, but just issues around how to enhance cultural responsiveness, how to enhance services that are culturally responsive to the communities that we are serving, that we are advocating with, and on behalf of. But there has to be decision makers in that. Talking to executive directors, CEOs of these nonprofits, chief of police, people who make those decisions. And, every year we're building these budgets. So every year you can increase a little bit more. Also, if we prioritize certain things, we will make it happen. For example, in the domestic violence movement, we know that transitional housing is one of those barriers that prevents survivors from leaving. So a lot of crisis centers have built fundraisers around purchasing property and building transitional housing or writing for grants for transitional housing. So it's really a matter of what you prioritize in your service. And we know that language access and culturally responsive services are significant barriers for people to leave or maintaining safety or having their legal rights protected. So I think that's another way from an organizational standpoint, being accountable. And if you already have a language access plan, just like any standard operating procedure or manual you have in your organization, do a community assessment. Assess what the cultural shifts have been in the community, because every community is different. We are now of global majority communities. We're not just Latinos and non-Latinos. I mean, we are of a global majority. So I would say we always recommend do a community assessment. What has been the shifts in languages spoken in your community? And if you don't know what those are, you can look at also at hospitals, schools, and they have that information as well. We've actually run out of time. We are at time. And so I want to be mindful of that. We're going to pause here for a moment. Just waiting for interpreter change. Thank you. So we've come at time. Unfortunately, we can go on and on in this conversation, and certainly I can. Want to thank our panelists for today. Again, you also see in the screen the QR code, and we will also put the link in the chat for the evaluation. So we ask you please complete the evaluation. My greatest gratitudes to our panelists today, Aracelia, Caitlin Payal, and of course, Robin from the ABA Commission on Domestic and Sexual Violence for being our co-sponsors in this panel. Thank you so much for what you do. I can tell your passion and your heart is in this work, just like those folks that have attended here today. This is not easy work. And by all means, what we discuss here is just a scratch in the surface. So if you ever need some support or need some technical assistance, you're definitely welcome to reach out to me or reach out to the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence, the ABA Commission on Domestic and Sexual Violence, Tahare Justice Center, Deaf Hope, and of course, Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid as well. We're all here to provide support and, so whatever you need from us. So again, thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our participants. We will be sharing the recording as well as the materials and resources that were mentioned here today. Again, please fill out the evaluation. Also, special thanks to our interpreters, Andrea and Christina. Thank you so much for being here in the space with us. Again, thank you everyone and hope you have a great rest of the week. Mm-hmm.